I was 23 years old when I discovered my parents had been calling every single job I applied to, telling them I was a thief. They destroyed 15 interviews, 6 job offers, and nearly my entire future. But what they didn't know was that my grandmother had been 3 steps ahead of them the whole time. And she'd left me something that would change everything. My name is Chen, and this nightmare started the day after my college graduation. I'd landed an interview at a prestigious marketing firm in downtown Boston. The kind of opportunity people dream about. I wore my best blazer, practiced my answers for hours, and walked into that building feeling like my life was finally beginning. The interview went perfectly. The hiring manager, Janet, smiled the entire time, asked me to start the following Monday, and shook my hand so firmly I thought I'd already made it. Then Monday morning came, and I got the call. Janet's voice was cold, professional, clipped. She said they'd received some concerning information about my character, that they couldn't move forward, that she wished me luck. I stood there in my apartment, already dressed for my first day, holding a coffee that suddenly tasted like acid. Completely blindsided, I thought it was a fluke, a misunderstanding, maybe a background check error. So I applied to 10 more places. I got interviews at 7 of them. Every single one went well, really well, the kind of well where they're already talking about team lunches and asking about my start date preferences. And every single one called back with the same message, delivered in increasingly uncomfortable tones. Concerning information, character issues. We've decided to go in a different direction. By the 4th rejection, I knew something was systematically wrong. By the 7th, I was having panic attacks in my bathroom at 2 in the morning, sobbing into towels so my roommate wouldn't hear. I'd graduated with honors. I had glowing references from professors. I'd never stolen anything in my entire life, not even a pencil from a hotel room. But someone was destroying me, and I had no idea who or why. It was my younger brother Marcus who finally told me the truth. He showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening, wouldn't look me in the eye, kept fidgeting with his phone. He said Mom and Dad had been making calls, that he'd overheard them, that they were telling potential employers I had a theft problem, that I'd stolen from previous jobs and family members, that I was dishonest and untrustworthy. He said they'd been doing it for months, ever since I'd gotten my degree. I couldn't breathe. My own parents, the people who'd raised me, who'd come to my graduation, who'd smiled in the family photos we'd taken that day. Marcus said he'd confronted them, and they'd told him it was for my own good, that I needed to learn humility, that I'd become too ambitious, too focused on career success, that I needed to be brought down a few notches before the world corrupted me. They actually believed they were saving me from myself. I drove to their house that night, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. I walked in without knocking, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager, and I found them in the living room watching television like nothing was wrong. My mother looked up with this pleasant smile, asked if I wanted tea. I asked them if it was true, if they'd been sabotaging my job applications. My father muted the TV, folded his hands, and said yes, calm as anything, like he was confirming the weather forecast. He said I'd lost my way, that college had filled my head with ideas about independence and success that weren't appropriate for someone my age, that I needed to stay close to home, work at local businesses where they could keep an eye on me, where I'd be safe from the corrupting influence of corporate culture. My mother nodded along, adding that they'd done this out of love, that someday I'd understand, that they were protecting me from making terrible mistakes. I told them they'd destroyed my life. My father said I was being dramatic. I told them I'd applied to 37 jobs in 4 months and gotten nowhere despite perfect qualifications. My mother said that proved I wasn't ready for those positions anyway. I told them what they'd done was illegal, that I could sue them. My father laughed, actually laughed, and said I had no proof, that it would be my word against theirs, that no employer would admit to making hiring decisions based on hearsay. That's when I brought up Grandma Linda, my grandmother on my mother's side, who'd passed away 2 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. I said Grandma would be ashamed of them, absolutely disgusted. And my mother's face changed, went hard and cold, and she said I had no right to invoke her mother's name, that Grandma Linda had spoiled me rotten, filled my head with the same ambitious nonsense that got me into this mess in the first place. See, Grandma Linda had been different from my parents in every possible way. She'd immigrated from Taiwan in the 70s, built a successful import business from nothing, put herself through night school, became a millionaire by 50. She'd always encouraged me, always told me to dream bigger, reach higher, never settle for someone else's limited vision of what I could be. My parents had resented her influence, I realize now, had seen her as a threat to their control over my life. I left their house that night knowing I'd never speak to them again unless they apologized and stopped their campaign against me, which seemed about as likely as snow in July. I went back to my apartment, collapsed on my bed, and that's when I remembered the letter. Grandma Linda had left me a letter, given to me by her lawyer right after the funeral, with strict instructions not to open it until I truly needed it. She'd made me promise, made me swear I'd know when the time was right. I found it in my desk drawer, still sealed in its cream, colored envelope, my name written in her elegant handwriting across the front. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside were 3 pages of her precise script and a small key taped to the final page. I started reading, and with every line, I felt like she was right there in the room with me, like she'd known exactly what was going to happen. The letter started with, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then your parents have likely done something terrible to try to control your life." I actually gasped out loud. She'd predicted it, had seen it coming years before it happened. She wrote about how she'd watched my parents become increasingly controlling as I grew older, how they'd always resented my independence, how they'd fought with her constantly about the way she encouraged my ambitions. Grandma Linda wrote that she'd set up a safety net for me, something my parents didn't know about and couldn't touch. The key was for a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, box number 417. Inside, she said, I'd find everything I needed to start over, to build the life I deserved, to escape their suffocating control once and for all. She told me she loved me, that she believed in me, that I should never let anyone make me smaller than I was meant to be. I went to the bank the next morning, didn't even wait for them to open, just stood outside the doors at 8:50, 5 with that key clutched in my fist. The manager, an older gentleman named Robert, led me to the vault, found box 417, and left me alone in a small private room. I slid the key into the lock, and my heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might pass out. Inside the box were documents, organized in neat folders with labels in Grandma's handwriting. The first folder contained the deed to a small commercial property in Cambridge, fully paid off, currently rented to a coffee shop with a lease that generated $4,000 a month in income. The property was in a trust with my name on it, had been for 5 years, completely separate from anything my parents could access or even knew existed. The second folder held stock certificates, investment accounts, bonds, all in my name, all managed by a financial advisor Grandma had hired specifically for me. The total value was just over $600,000. $600,000 that had been sitting there, growing, waiting for the moment I needed it. I had to read the statements 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. The third folder was the one that made me cry. It contained letters of recommendation from Grandma's business associates, CEOs and entrepreneurs she'd worked with over the decades. All pre-written, all addressed, to whom it may concern, all glowing endorsements of my character, work ethic, and potential. She'd collected them before she got sick, had them all notarized and ready to use. There were 12 of them from people who ran companies I'd only dreamed of working for. But the fourth folder was the nuclear option. It contained a complete dossier on my parents' financial situation, every debt, every late payment, every shady business dealing my father had ever been involved in. Grandma had hired a private investigator, documented everything, and left it all for me with a note that said, "Use this only if you must, but know that you have the power to protect yourself if they try to destroy you." There was also a prepaid phone, still charged, with one contact saved in it. The contact was labeled Robert Chen, attorney. I called the number right there in that little bank room, and a man answered on the second ring. He said he'd been expecting my call. That Grandma Linda had retained him years ago specifically to help me when this day came. He said he'd been monitoring the situation, that he already had a cease and desist letter drafted, ready to send to my parents the moment I gave the word. Robert Chen, no relation despite the last name, explained that what my parents had done was textbook tortious interference, that I had grounds for a substantial civil suit, that he had a colleague who specialized in employment law who would take my case pro bono just based on Grandma's reputation alone. He said I didn't have to do anything I wasn't comfortable with, but I had options, real legal options that would stop my parents permanently. I sat in that bank room for 2 hours, going through every document, every statement, every possibility. Grandma Linda had given me complete financial independence, professional connections that bypassed my parents entirely, and the legal ammunition to fight back if necessary. She'd built me an entire escape hatch, and I'd been sitting on it for 2 years without even knowing it existed. The rental income alone was enough to cover my expenses while I figured out my next move. The investment accounts meant I could take my time, be selective, wait for the right opportunity instead of desperately applying to everything that moved. The letters of recommendation from her associates meant I had credibility from sources my parents couldn't touch or undermine. I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't helpless. I had everything I needed to build the exact life I wanted. I called Robert Chen back that afternoon and told him to send the cease and desist letter. It was delivered to my parents' house by courier the next day. Very official, very legal, very clear about the consequences if they continued their interference. The letter outlined every call they'd made, every lie they'd told, included affidavits from 2 employers who'd been willing to testify about the defamatory information they'd received, and promised litigation that would bankrupt them if they didn't stop immediately. My father called me within an hour of receiving it, furious, shouting about betrayal and disrespect, and how dare I threaten them with lawyers. I let him rant for about 30 seconds, then I calmly explained that I had independent wealth now, that I didn't need them for anything, that their control over my life was finished, that if they ever contacted another employer on my behalf again, they'd be sued into oblivion. Then I hung up while he was still talking. My mother tried a different approach, showed up at my apartment 3 days later with tears and apologies and explanations about how they'd only wanted what was best for me. I let her stand in my doorway while I told her that sabotaging someone's career and lying about them being a thief was not love, it was abuse, it was control, it was cruelty dressed up as concern. I told her I'd forgiven them for a lot of things over the years, but this was different. This had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. She tried to tell me that Grandma Linda had poisoned me against them, that the money and property were her way of driving a wedge between us. I actually laughed, which made my mother flinch. I told her that Grandma Linda had simply given me the tools to protect myself from people who claimed to love me, but actively worked to destroy my future. I told her the wedge had been driven by their own actions, their own lies, their own toxic need to control every aspect of my life. I used one of Grandma's letters of recommendation to get an interview at a tech startup in Cambridge, a company founded by one of her former business partners. I didn't mention my parents, didn't mention the previous rejections, just showed up prepared and confident and qualified. They offered me the job on the spot, director of marketing. Salary $80,000 a year plus equity, exactly the kind of position I'd been qualified for all along. My first month's paycheck sat in my bank account next to the rental income from Grandma's property, and I felt something I hadn't felt in almost a year, like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. I was 23 years old, financially independent, professionally successful, and completely free from the people who tried to keep me small and scared and dependent. Marcus called me sometimes, updated me on the family situation. He said our parents were furious that they'd consulted their own lawyer about suing me for defamation, which went nowhere because truth is an absolute defense. He said they'd told relatives I'd stolen Grandma's inheritance, turned her against them in her final years, manipulated a dying woman for money. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic, but some relatives knew better. The ones who'd actually known Grandma Linda, who understood what kind of person she was. They reached out to me, quietly, separately, told me they were proud of me for standing up to my parents, that they'd watched my mother and father become increasingly controlling and narcissistic over the years, that someone needed to break the pattern. My Aunt Jessica, Mom's younger sister, actually took me out to lunch and told me Grandma had confided in her about the safety deposit box, had made her promise not to say anything until I found it myself. Jessica told me that Grandma Linda had set everything up in the last year of her life, when the cancer diagnosis made her think seriously about legacy and protection. She'd watched my parents try to discourage me from going to college out of state, watch them guilt, trip me about choosing a major they didn't approve of, watch them slowly try to shrink my world down to something they could manage and control. And she decided that when she couldn't be there to advocate for me anymore, her money and connections and careful planning would do it instead. The coffee shop renting Grandma's property turned out to be called Linda's Brew, named by the owner who'd been one of Grandma's first employees back in the 80s. The owner, a woman named Patricia, invited me to visit, showed me around, told me stories about Grandma that I'd never heard. She said Grandma Linda had sold her the business for almost nothing when she'd retired, had helped her get started, had been a mentor and friend for decades. She'd been paying rent on the property at below market rates as part of their agreement, but the income was still substantial, still reliable, still exactly what I needed. Patricia told me that Grandma had come to her 2 years before she died, had asked if she'd be willing to continue the lease long term, had explained that the property would go to her granddaughter, who might need stable income someday. Patricia had agreed immediately, had even increased the rent slightly to make sure it kept pace with inflation. She said Grandma Linda had been incredibly strategic, incredibly thoughtful, that every decision she'd made about the property had been with my future in mind. I started investing the rental income, following the advice of the financial advisor Grandma had hired. His name was Thomas Wang, and he'd been managing her portfolio for 15 years. He walked me through every investment, explained the strategy behind the stocks and bonds she'd chosen, taught me how to read financial statements and market trends. He said Grandma had insisted that when I inherited the accounts, I should understand exactly what I had and how to protect it. Within 6 months of starting my new job, I'd saved enough to put a down payment on a small condo in Cambridge, walking distance from the office, a place that was entirely mine with no history of my parents' influence or control. I painted the walls teal and gold, Grandma's favorite colors, hung photos of her throughout the apartment, kept her letter framed on my desk, where I could see it every single day. My career took off in ways I'd barely imagined possible. The startup grew fast. My team expanded from 3 people to 15. My responsibilities increased. My equity became actually valuable when we got Series B funding. The CEO, Jonathan Park, told me I was the best hire he'd ever made, that Grandma Linda had called him personally before she died to tell him about me, to make him promise he'd give me a fair shot if I ever applied. I found out later that she'd done that with all 12 of the people who'd written recommendation letters, had called them individually, told them about her granddaughter, who was brilliant and ambitious and might need help someday, asked them to remember me if I ever reached out. She'd built me a network before I even knew I needed one, had leveraged every relationship she'd spent decades cultivating, all to make sure I had options when my parents inevitably tried to cage me. About a year after everything happened, my father sent me an email. No phone call, no visit. Just a cold email that said they'd consulted with their pastor, decided to forgive me for my disrespect and legal threats, and were willing to reconcile if I apologized and acknowledged that they'd only been trying to protect me. The audacity of it actually made me laugh out loud in my office. I didn't respond. Robert Chen had advised me to keep all communications in case we ever needed them for legal purposes, but not to engage, not to give them any opening to manipulate or guilt, trip, or worm their way back into my life. So I saved the email in a folder and went back to work on a campaign that would end up winning industry awards and getting me promoted to vice president of marketing at 25 years old. Marcus kept me updated on the family drama I was missing, the narrative my parents had constructed where they were the victims of my ingratitude and grandma's manipulation. They'd apparently told people at their church that I'd cut them off because they wouldn't give me money, that grandma had left me her estate specifically to create division in the family, that I'd become greedy and materialistic and cruel. None of it touched me anymore because I'd built a life completely separate from their influence, a life where their opinions and lies and toxic control had exactly zero impact. I started dating someone I met through work, a software engineer named David, who had no connection to my family, no history with any of it. Just a genuine, healthy relationship built on mutual respect and support. When I told him about what my parents had done, he was appropriately horrified, asked if I wanted help getting a restraining order, offered to go with me to therapy if I needed to process the trauma of it all. The difference between his reaction and my parents' justifications was so stark it almost made me dizzy. On the second anniversary of Grandma Linda's death, I visited her grave with flowers and a letter of my own. I told her about the job, the promotion, the condo, the relationship, the life I'd built using the foundation she'd so carefully constructed. I told her that her letter had saved me, that her planning had given me freedom, that her belief in me had carried me through the darkest period of my life. I told her I was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I don't think I'd ever been before. The tech startup went public when I was 26, and my equity turned into actual life, changing money, enough that I could have retired if I wanted to. I didn't want to retire. I loved my work, but the security was incredible, the knowledge that I'd never be dependent on anyone, never be vulnerable to the kind of control my parents had tried to exercise. I bought a house, a real house with a yard and a home office and enough space to breathe. Marcus eventually moved out of our parents' house, got his own apartment, started rebuilding a relationship with me on his own terms. He apologized for not telling me sooner about the phone calls, said he'd been scared of our parents, scared of causing family drama, scared of taking sides. I understood because I'd been there too, had lived under their control, had known what it was like to be afraid of disappointing them. We started having dinner once a week, just the two of us, building a sibling relationship that wasn't mediated through our parents' toxicity. He told me that our parents had tried to get him to spy on me, to report back about my job and finances and personal life. He'd refused, which had caused its own set of problems, their accusations that he'd chosen me over family, their attempts to guilt him into maintaining their information pipeline. But he'd held firm, had started setting boundaries, had begun his own journey toward independence from their controlling behavior. I never sued my parents, never pursued the legal case Robert Chen had prepared so thoroughly. The cease and desist letter had worked. They'd stopped calling employers, stopped actively sabotaging my career. The threat had been enough, and I didn't want to spend years of my life locked in litigation with people I was trying to move past. Robert understood, said the option would always be there if they ever crossed the line again, but that sometimes the high road was also the healthiest road. My mother tried one more time to reconcile when I turned 27, sent me a birthday card with a long handwritten letter about regret and misunderstanding and how much they missed me. She didn't apologize for what they'd done, didn't acknowledge that calling employers to lie about me being a thief was abuse, just vague language about mistakes and miscommunication and how families should forgive each other. I read it once, felt nothing, and put it in the folder with all the other documentation. I thought about responding, about explaining one more time why what they'd done was unforgivable, why their refusal to take actual responsibility made reconciliation impossible. But I realized I didn't owe them that labor, Didn't owe them my emotional energy or my time or my explanation. They knew what they'd done. They'd chosen to do it. They'd lost me as a consequence. That was the end of the story. The financial advisor, Thomas, told me that Grandma Linda's investment strategy had been specifically designed to grow conservatively, but steadily, to provide long-term security rather than quick returns. He said she'd talked about me constantly in their meetings, had been so proud of my college acceptances, my academic achievements, my ambition and drive. He said she'd worried openly about my parents, about their need to control, about what they might do when I started becoming truly independent. I wished I could tell her she'd been right to worry, right to plan, right to build me that escape hatch. I wished I could thank her for seeing what I couldn't see yet, for protecting me from people I'd trusted implicitly, for loving me enough to give me freedom instead of trying to keep me close and dependent. Every success I had, every milestone I reached, felt like a tribute to her faith in me, her strategic planning, her absolute refusal to let my parents limit what I could become. The property in Cambridge appreciated significantly, the coffee shop continued to thrive. Patricia eventually approached me about buying the building outright so she could leave it to her own daughter. We negotiated a fair price. I sold it to her for slightly below market value because I knew that's what Grandma would have wanted, and I invested the proceeds in a diversified portfolio that would continue generating passive income for decades. I started a scholarship fund at my alma mater in Grandma Linda's name, specifically for students from controlling or abusive family situations who needed financial independence to pursue their education and careers. The first year, we funded 3 students. By year 5, we were funding 20 students annually, covering tuition, housing, and living expenses, giving them the same kind of freedom and security Grandma had given me. One of those students, a young woman named Melissa, reached out to me after graduation to say that the scholarship had literally saved her life, that her parents had threatened to disown her if she didn't study what they wanted, marry who they wanted, live where they wanted. The scholarship had given her the independence to make her own choices, to pursue engineering instead of nursing, to move across the country for a dream job, to build a life on her own terms. Reading her letter felt like Grandma's legacy multiplying, spreading out into the world, helping people I'd never meet break free from the same patterns. David proposed to me on the 3rd anniversary of finding Grandma's safety deposit box. Said he'd chosen that date because it represented the moment I'd truly become free, the moment I'd stepped into the life I was meant to have. We got married in a small ceremony with friends and colleagues in Marcus. No parents, no drama, just people who genuinely loved and supported us. It felt right, felt whole, felt like exactly what Grandma would have wanted for me. I'm 31 now. 8 years past that terrible morning when Janet called to rescind my first job offer. 8 years past discovering my parents had been systematically destroying my future. I run my own marketing consultancy, work with startups and nonprofits, set my own hours, answer to no one. The life I have now would have been impossible without Grandma Linda's planning, without her willingness to protect me even after she was gone, without her absolute certainty that I deserved better than what my parents were willing to give me. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if she hadn't left me that safety deposit box, if I'd never found the property deed and the investment accounts and the letters of recommendation. I think I would have survived eventually, would have figured something out, but the journey would have been so much harder, so much longer, so much more damaging. She gave me a shortcut through hell, and I use that gift every single day to build something worth having. My parents are still alive, still living in the same house, still telling anyone who listened their version of events, where they're the victims and I'm the ungrateful child. I don't care anymore. Their narrative doesn't touch me, doesn't define me, doesn't have any power over the life I've built. They made their choices, I made mine, and we live in completely separate worlds now. The last thing Grandma Linda wrote in her letter, the very last line, was this: "You are not responsible for their choices, only your own. Choose freedom, choose growth, choose the biggest life you can imagine. I'll be cheering for you from wherever I end up. I read those words at least once a week, have them memorized, carry them with me as a reminder that someone believed in me completely, unconditionally, with no strings attached, and no need to keep me small. That's what real love looks like, I've learned. Not control disguised as concern, not sabotage justified as protection, not limitations framed as guidance. Real love gives you wings and trusts you to fly, builds you safety nets but doesn't stop you from taking risks, celebrates your success instead of feeling threatened by it. Grandma Linda loved me that way, and now I'm learning to love myself that way too, to trust my own judgment, to reach for opportunities without waiting for permission from people who've proven they don't want me to soar. The trust fund is still growing. The scholarship helps more students every year. My company is profitable and meaningful. My marriage is healthy and supportive. And I sleep at night knowing I broke the cycle of control that could have defined my entire life. That's Grandma Linda's real legacy. Not the money or the property, but the freedom to become exactly who I was meant to be, unbounded by other people's fear and insecurity, and need to dominate. I tell this story sometimes at speaking engagements, at conferences, at networking events where young professionals ask how I built my career. I tell them about Grandma Linda, about the safety deposit box, about the choice between staying trapped by other people's toxicity or accepting help that lets you break free. I tell them that sometimes the people who are supposed to support you will try to destroy you instead. And that's not your fault. That's not your failing. That's their damage revealing itself. And I tell them what Grandma told me in that letter. You deserve a life bigger than other people's limitations. You deserve opportunities that match your abilities. You deserve to be celebrated instead of sabotaged. And sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the tools to save yourself. She gave me those tools. I used them to build something beautiful. And now I'm passing that knowledge forward to anyone who needs to hear it. That's how you honor someone's legacy, I think. Not by protecting their memory or defending their choices, but by taking what they gave you and multiplying it, spreading it outward, using their gifts to help other people escape the same traps. Grandma Linda saved me, and now I'm saving others, and those others will save more people in turn. And the impact of her love and planning and strategic brilliance will ripple forward long after everyone who knew her personally is gone. My parents destroyed 15 job opportunities before I discovered what they were doing, but Grandma Linda created infinite opportunities through her planning and foresight. The math on that is pretty clear. The contrast is pretty stark, and the lesson is pretty simple. Some people will try to keep you caged, but the right person, giving you the right tools at the right time, can set you free forever. I'm free now, truly free, and I'm never going back. I keep Grandma's letter in a fireproof safe now, next to my will, next to the documents that ensure if I have children someday, they'll have their own safety net, their own escape hatch if they ever need it. Because that's what breaking generational cycles looks like. That's what real protection means. That's what love does when it's not twisted up with control and fear and the desperate need to keep people small. My parents told every employer I was a thief, tried to steal my future before it even began. But Grandma Linda had already prepared for that, had seen it coming from miles away, had loved me enough to give me everything I needed to survive their sabotage and build something they could never touch. And in the end, that made all the difference.